From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
The top two ACTU leaders, Secretary Sally McManus and President Michelle O'Neill, have announced they'll both be stepping down from their roles in the coming months. McManus took up her position in 2017. Since then, the union movement has faced the challenges of COVID and the activities of the rogue CFMEU, which the government has since placed in administration. But on the positive side, Labor's coming to power in 2022 and its retention of power in 2025 has presented the ACTU with a major opportunity to implement much of the union movement's agenda, and it has certainly seized that opportunity. Today on the podcast, Sally McManus joins us to talk about the achievements of these past years, the problems that they've brought, and what's ahead for the union movement. Sally McManus, you've won a lot from the Albanese government. What have been the most important 3 or 4 big measures that you've got, and what have been the rebuffs that you've received?
Well, the most important thing has been repairing the bargaining system, and I won't go into all the boring technicalities of that, but some of the big changes include multi-employer bargaining, but overall that's made a huge difference in terms of now the number of agreements that have been reached when it was on life support and the wage outcomes. There are also a whole 47 actually new rights. I won't go through the 47, but I'll just point to same job, same pay, which is basically gives labour hire workers the same pay if they're working next to someone doing the same job, which has become a really big issue, or it had become. The right to disconnect, which every worker, now gets, and world first rights for gig economy workers. There's a heap more, but if I had to pick them, that's the ones I'd pick. In terms of rebuffs, we always would like the system actually to be more simple. Employers don't think that, but we do. And inevitably, you have ideas about what you would like to see, and departments as well as employers want to build in sort of endless guardrails and exceptions, et cetera, and it really just makes things more complicated than they need to be.
Don't the unions also try to build in guardrails?
Well, the way we wanted the bargaining system to work, for example, we wanted sort of universal access to a lot of the new things that we got in there. And, for example, we would have liked multi-employer bargaining to be more widely available than it is. Our guardrails were really to do with just making sure that people can't be exploited. But when you're designing new systems or bringing in something new, you want to try and make it as simple as possible.
So for the rest of this parliamentary term, what will the ACTU be wanting from the Labor government? What will be its priorities in its discussions with the government?
The priorities will be implementing some of the announcements made at the Labor Party conference that was held just recently. So one of those big ones was to do with an employment court, Fair Work Court, I think it was referred to as, which will be really important. Another big announcement there was to do with ending lockouts, where employers can essentially take industrial action and refuse to pay workers and do that forever, and there's sort of no limits on it. So we want to see those implemented, because there's a difference between announcing things and actually doing things. And I suppose after that, that'll be up to new leaders of the ACTU to reset sort of the agenda and where they want to take things.
Do we have any idea who will be taking over at the top?
We don't at the moment. I expect over the coming weeks, ACTU executive, which is made up of all the unions, will be meeting to discuss that matter and hopefully appoint a new secretary, because I'd like to do a handover, and I'm leaving on the 30th of August.
Not much time. But I guess there won't be 2 women at the top again for a while.
I wouldn't put bets on that.
So what's the relationship between business and the union movement, especially the ACTU at the moment?
Well, I feel that the big business employer groups like the BCA or ACCI or AIG, which are the three main ones, they sort of appear not to really want a relationship, or if they do, a very surface one. And I suppose that that's their decision. It's not ours. They made that decision not long after the Albanese government got elected. I think actually that wasn't in their interests, but that's what they decided. We do have good relations with individual employers that we work with, but I would say it's not exactly a strong relationship with the employer groups in general.
Would you like to strengthen that relationship? Would it be useful to do so?
Look, I think it's always important that there is, functioning, strong relationships between those bodies, not because we're going to agree on much or anything, which isn't true. Actually, we do, but the majority you won't. But one of the things that was a shame in Australia when COVID hit is that those relationships weren't there, and they weren't there with the employer groups, and they weren't there with actually the coalition. Ministers were meeting the relevant unions for the first time in the middle of lockdowns. And that wasn't good for the country, because when everyone had to work together, you didn't have some underlying, understanding of each other.
From your point of view, do you think the balance between workers and employers is still too stacked against workers? Obviously, some of these concessions you've got from the government have redressed that balance or changed that balance somewhat, but are you still not happy with that balance?
Well, laws are important because you've got to recognise the innate power imbalance. Employers innately have more power over workers because, of course, they hire and they fire them. They have more power, and that's just life. That's accepted. And so laws have got to play an important role in balancing that. If you don't balance that, you basically have a terribly unfair system. It leads to shocking inequality and no one shares in anything. But at the same time, it's also about workers organising in their unions. That gives them power as well. If you ask me, which you did, where I think it's at the moment, I think the jury is out about this. And it's the reason is the key indicators, which we keep a very close eye on. So workers' share of the GDP, real wage growth, the gender pay gap, and how many permanent jobs there are as opposed to insecure jobs. All of those indicators had been going in the right, had turned around quite dramatically after we got those laws passed. And so you could actually see in the statistics the turnaround in bargaining power, which was great. However, of course, real wage growth has now stalled and going backwards because of inflation. So that's a big question. And we still haven't recovered what we've lost in terms of our share of the overall nation's wealth over a period of several decades where it went backwards for quite a long time. We haven't shared in the productivity growth either over the last 26 years. So I would say that there's catch up to be done before you can start talking about balance.
But there's got to be overall catch up, surely, not just.
That's my point. Like, your average worker is still a long way behind where they were if you considered the productivity gains since the year 2000. It's a lot of money that's gone to capital or to employers as opposed to workers. It's not been fairly shared. And, it's frustrating to me that there's discussions about this and people say, oh, well, you can't have pay increases because of productivity or this or that. Well, they didn't say it the other way around when we were losing, and there's catch up to be done, and that really needs to be recognised.
But there's been a long period since we've had serious productivity growth.
Yeah, that is true, although we have had productivity growth, and the productivity growth we have had hasn't been fairly shared with workers.
You've been campaigning strongly against Pauline Hanson, trying to warn workers that her industrial relations policies would harm them. Why do you think that some proportion of workers are attracted to Pauline Hanson?
I think it's clear that people are under a lot of economic pressure because real wages aren't growing again, and that we haven't caught up to where we were. So people feel as though they've gone backwards, and it's not just a feeling, it's actually true. So people are looking for explanations for that and anger at the status quo, whatever government's in power for it. And I think they're looking for a way to express that anger, but also looking for alternatives. So I think that's what's a part of what is driving support for One Nation.
Now, way back in 2019, you called for the resignation of CFMEU Victorian Secretary John Setka. This was nearly 5 years before the Labor government placed this union into administration. Can you just tell us something of the personal struggle you had with him and his allies in this very militant and extremely badly behaving union?
Yeah, well, that was a very tough thing to do at the time, and it was done with the support of 95% of union leaders and unions. And let's just say he didn't take it very well. If he's got a list of enemies, I'm sure if I'm not at the top, I'm in the top five. And that wasn't fun. It's continued not to be fun. And so, John doesn't hold back on what he thinks. And when you're the leader of a union and of lots of members, people listen to what you say. So there's a responsibility with leadership that I'm always aware of and that others are always aware of. If he was, it's not clear to me because obviously he derided me and others to his members, to others. And, that obviously meant that it wasn't very comfortable for a long period of time in the streets of Melbourne. And that only got worse, obviously, once the CFMEU was put into administration and people were looking for people to blame because, obviously the people actually responsible and the people who made all the decisions, and that's all the people who've been removed, didn't want to blame themselves. And so they were very quick to point the finger at, me and Michelle and others at the ACTU. So, yeah, that wasn't very fun. So it's quite just hostile. If you walk past a building site, there were a lot of abuse and threats that came through the ACTU to me, and warnings from police then about my own safety. And so, yeah, as people know, I had to spend a bit of time out of Melbourne and had to be extra careful for a period of time. I mean, that's all died down, but I wouldn't say it's gone away.
So do you still feel somewhat threatened by those people perhaps no longer in the union, but by those people?
I don't know. Something happened, Michelle, a while ago now. Something just clicked in my brain. It was like, I just don't care. I just don't care. I just think, well, you guys do what you want. I'm not backing down. I'm not changing. And make all your threats. I don't care. And so, I don't know. That was, however I got to that point, and it was extremely liberating. I don't know if it's wise, but it's liberating. And I sort of intend to keep thinking that way.
Did you realise the extent to which criminal behaviour was going on, was being perpetrated by those in the union back in 2019? Or did the extent of this criminal behaviour only become clear to you as more evidence came out?
2019, absolutely not. At the time, I thought this was a personal issue and it was about domestic violence and it was about...
That is violence to Setka's wife.
Yeah, which he pleaded guilty to. So that, and I thought it was just about his individual behaviours. And perhaps it was back then. Even, I read the Jeffrey Watson report and it sort of seems to be clear that, what's alleged in there didn't really wind up until several years after that into what it ended up becoming. And what happened, you've got to understand, is that moment where we'd asked John to stand down and he didn't, caused a huge rift in the union movement between the ACTU and all the unions in the ACTU and the CFMEU. And so they sort of went, from my perspective, dark. I didn't know what was going on in there in a basic way. You as ACTU secretary, you've got some idea in most unions because you're talking to the leaders all the time. But what happened is there was recriminations internally in that union, and good people who had stood up to John, men who'd stood up to John, were driven out one by one, including the leader, Michael O'Connor, who I used to talk to all the time. And then essentially that sort of continued. And I wouldn't have had a clue what was happening in that union. And they, as much as you ever know what's happening somewhere, but not a clue. And then even when it sort of, first came out, the first building bad story, was bad. I thought it was bad, but nowhere near as bad as what has since sort of come out. And so it's pretty clear, it seems, that there's a criminal ecosystem that operates there. Like the thought that, certain Melbourne gangsters were playing a role in how all of this works was absolutely horrifying, not just to me, but to every union leader. Like, we guard our reputations and what we care about, and the fact that, we've known so many union leaders in the CFMU over the years that were corruption fighters. Like, they had to fight people who were corrupt, including mainly developers, builders, things like that. They were the people that I'd learnt from over the years. And so to see it sort of these sort of level of moral compromise was shocking.
So was the trying to deal with the CFMEU the worst thing you faced as secretary?
Oh, I think COVID was harder. So that gives you an idea about how hard COVID was. Different things entirely, but just a level of pressure that was real, but also you felt it at a time where you're alone, literally, was significant. Like when you knew that millions of workers were facing losing their jobs, and you knew that hundreds of thousands of union members were working in hospitals and they could get this deadly virus and die. That was the worst thing, really, worse than this.
But just coming back to the CFMEU, do you support and welcome the Royal Commission that the state government has now announced, and should it have been announced earlier?
Well, they've announced it, and I do believe a lot more needs to be done, clearly, to deal with this ecosystem, because the union's in administration and it's known what's happened in the union. But if you think about it, the unions and the workers are one small part of that whole ecosystem, and that in a way I think it's been convenient for some of the employers and the labour hire companies and all of that to have the spotlight on the union, because then the spotlight wasn't on them. And that's been a particular frustration over the last 2 years. I just see them ducking and weaving and wanting to keep out of the limelight. And it's just not right that all of the blame should be on the union or workers, that's for sure, that are union members in that industry, when clearly a whole lot of people have got very, very rich. And I'm not talking about, the pay levels of construction workers who do hard jobs. Like, the whole way that industry has operated in Victoria in particular is based on not just subcontracting, but subcontracting, like creating layers of middle people who are clipping the ticket, and they're doing so in ways that are not just unethical but unlawful, and using violence. So we absolutely want to see all of that cleaned up. It has to be cleaned up in order for the union in Victoria anyway to be corruption resilient, because, you can do everything to reform the union, but if you have, corrupt employers and middle people knocking on the door all the time, it's just a matter of time. And so every other Royal Commission is just concentrated on the union for political reasons. If this Royal Commission looks at everything and comes up with an answer that is a holistic one, I can only see that as a positive, because we never ever want to go through this again.
But do you think that the construction industry will ever be completely corruption resilient? Because it seems to be prone to corruption in many countries indeed.
Look, you raise a very good point, and that is true. Construction industry around the world is rife with corruption. Part of it has got to do, though, I think, with structural reasons that make it more or less likely for that to occur. Even if you look at the differences in states in Australia, the level of corruption in Victoria is on another scale. In New South Wales, it is there, and it's there all around the country, but just not like this. And I I, won't predict this, but I think part of the reason is the absolute proliferation of labour hire. The more sort of holes and levers you've got to be able to, extort, build fake gates that you then put a toll on, the more likely it is to be corrupt. And so you look at various times through history where we've not had that type of enterprise bargaining with like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of EBAs. Well, we haven't had that level of corruption because the opportunities weren't there on that industrial scale.
I want to turn to AI, which obviously is going to be absolutely transformational for the economy and indeed for many, many workers. What efforts has the union movement already put in place to deal with this revolution?
Well, a lot. So it's not as if we're strangers to industrial change or changes in workplaces. And Australian workers, when actually the textile industry shut down, for strong rights and that we have, which are a bit unique compared to other countries. And that's an obligation on all employers to consult when technological change is being rolled out, not when they decide to sack people, but when it's been rolled out. So that is like very important in terms of people's rights and then needing to exercise them. Also, we're concerned about obviously the use of AI leading to work intensification, leading to excessive monitoring, about the data being stolen, about the theft of creatives' works, and then there's predictions by some, but some self-serving people as well of mass job losses. Now, the last one, we don't know if that's going to happen or not. And over my time as secretary, I've had heaps of people want to predict that other changes were going to, wipe out these jobs and wipe out those jobs. Yet workforce participation is at its highest level ever. So I think the jury's out with that part of it. But what we will be wanting to do is ensure that the workplace rights that we do have are fit for purpose, and they either will be or they won't be. And if they're not, well, then there'll be an expectation from unions and I think the community in general that any government will act to protect Australians and Australian workers in this circumstance.
So you'll want tougher rules from the government if it appears that workers are not getting enough say in the rollout of AI, or if their position is being diminished, threatened by it.
Well, the argument from employers and also the government says this, and you can't argue with it on one level, right? They say the current rights that are in place are technology neutral. So regardless of the technology coming in, the consultation rights that are there to protect workers are there. And so therefore you don't need, special AI rights. And I would say that I would give a bit of nuance to that. Those rights were developed in the context of the textile industry shutting down. This is not the textile industry shutting down. This could be across the whole of the economy. And if that's the case, we will need different rights to cope with something that will be on another scale. So, like I said, and I think you did characterise it fairly, that we'll be watching to see if our current rights are strong enough or fit for purpose for AI. If they're not, we will be wanting them to be upgraded.
So, how are workers going to have a say in the rollout? How does this work on the ground, do you think?
So, current law for every Australian worker is that your employer must consult you if they're bringing about or introducing technology that affects your skills. Now, does AI affect your skills? Of course, you're going to need new skills or different skills. Does it affect your promotional opportunities? Yes, it could. Does it affect job design? Well, all the discussions I've had with employers, yes. And so if those things exist, well, the employer must consult when they decide to roll out AI. And so that means talking to your workforce about what you're doing and why, how you think this is going to affect them and their jobs and their skills, and what are you going to do as the employer to mitigate any negative impacts. So this doesn't have to be massively complicated. It could be a very simple undertaking or discussion with your workers about, actually, we don't know what this is going to mean into the future, but we have no intentions of anyone's jobs being lost. We'll guarantee that we're not going to do that. What we're wanting is for people to embrace it, and we will train you up and provide you the skills to do so, and we'll keep talking to you about it along the way. I see some companies doing this well, like Commonwealth Bank have set up a whole skills sort of retraining thing where they can see what jobs will be there definitely in the future, like cybersecurity, and saying to workers that might be in a position that's more vulnerable, like, say, the call centre, we'll commit to you that we'll retrain you into these other roles. Now, that's consultation done well. Unfortunately, some HR managers have been taught over the time that you only consult workers once you decide to get rid of their jobs. That's not the case. In Australian law, you've got to consult when you bring in technology that's going to affect them in that way, and that's, in the case of AI, immediately.
But isn't it unrealistic to think that no jobs would be lost, because we see redundancies all the time in companies?
So I do think that at the moment we're seeing it happen in tech companies, and we're seeing that happen in tech companies in Australia, and we're seeing it happen elsewhere, and that this happens when change completely wipes out our roles. It doesn't appear to be yet to be going beyond that. However, if it does, right, and that there's a very big possibility that it could, what will be needed will be way more than we'll consult and then you lose your job, because people won't be able to adjust. They won't be able to find jobs elsewhere because those jobs won't exist because AI has got rid of them too, in which case there will be an expectation on the government from everyone not to sit back and just let that happen. Like, what are we going to do? Just say, okay, all of that wealth is going to be shifted to the companies that are extracting those productivity gains with nothing back to the workers. In fact, the workers all losing their jobs. At that point, if that happened, we'd be demanding shorter working hours for no loss of pay as a means of sharing those benefits. That's something that the government could do. Obviously, if that type of thing happened, there'd be a whole lot of things that would need to be considered, as we have in the past, like free training. You might want to do things around, say, for example, people's HECS debts and not having HECS if you having to pay if you're displaced because of AI. These are just ideas, right? But the type of things that you would need to do if that type of displacement happened.
So will dealing with the issues around AI be the biggest challenge for your successor?
I think that there's the immediate challenge of cost of living pressures that we talked about before, and about real wages now not rising. That's the immediate issue. And that can only be addressed through workers organising and using the new tools they've got. So those workers who are doing that through bargaining are keeping up, other workers are not. And so that's a big challenge, number one. And that's the thing that's on the forefront of workers' minds. So it's got to be on the forefront of your mind as a leader. Then I would say the two other big challenges are AI, as you mentioned. This could be like a very significant change to work. And secondly, the rise of the far right and its threat to democracy, its threat to working people on multiple levels.
And finally, Sally McManus, what of your own future?
Well, I've been a union leader for 22 years and I was 55 last week. And it's a long time, and 9.5 years in this role. And that includes those COVID years, which I reckon I get double, like they're worth double, not 1 year, or 2 years. And so honestly, I need a break. I'm looking forward to doing that. I've got leave entitlements thanks to unions. So I'm going to use that to go bird watching and just see what life's like on the other side. Also, unfortunately, I've lost all hearing in one of my ears. And so I'm going to have a cochlear implant, which I know you've got to really concentrate on the rehab for that. So I want to give myself the best shot of that. So, I mean, it's one of those things. It's hard when you come from a working class background to think, oh my God, what am I going to do next? Where's money coming from? Am I useful? I'm trying to put all of that out of my head and sort of just embrace the unknown. And after I've had the implant and done that, it'll be time for me to, okay, what am I going to do next? And I just definitely know that I want to, contribute. I definitely want to contribute to making the world a better place and just finding my place in that, and, hopefully helping, new leaders and, movements that are part of that. I've got some skills to offer.
Well, Sally McManus, all the best for the future. Thank you so much for being with us today. That's all for this podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.